Yeah. Okay, cool. I'm Sarah and I'm part of the Roots project. So the webinar is being coordinated by a migrant refugee fundraising platform. So if you guys want any more information about that or any like future events, we do them every Tuesday. So if you want any more information on more after this, it's in the chat section of this. But yeah, thanks for coming. I'll hand you over to Rosie now. I think that's cool.
Hello, I'm Rosie. Several of you know me, and welcome very much. This is my first webinar. I've been to various Zoom meetings and gone to other people's webinars, but I've never done a webinar, so you'll have to bear with me. I'm feeling very amateur at that. Also quite amateur really at being a naturalist. I flagged up and offered to do this wildlife thing in my garden, but although I've got a sort of ecology biology background, I'm not a naturalist, so I'm not trained or that skilled in spotting things. But actually I've lived in this garden in this house in Burley in Leeds for about 30 years. Most of the time I've been busy bringing up a daughter and not had time to do other than keep a bit of a go at the garden. But in the last few years after she'd gone, and more recently, when I've been out gardening, I've noticed different things alive in my garden and started trying to identify them. So that's where this comes from, this interest in particular wildlife in my garden. And I've done quite a bit more in a random kind of way to try and encourage wildlife. There's huge amounts of information on the internet and in books and things about wildlife and how to do wildlife gardens. So I'm not going to attempt to do any of that. But I thought if I just talked people through some of the things in my garden and some of my approaches, it might encourage people to take an interest and to do a bit more. So that's really, what this is about. It's a funny time of the year to be doing it because obviously it's winter and everything's hibernating or died back. But in some ways, that's a good time to do it because it's a time for planning and research and sort of contemplating things, and especially in lockdown, it's probably quite a good time to be able to wonder what you might do and do a bit of research and start planning, and then do it when it gets a bit warmer. So over the years, I suppose the last 5 years maybe, like I say, I've been out gardening, I've noticed something, I've tried to take a photo of it, and then a bit later I've tried to identify what it is, and I've now got a kind of database of things, and there's about 140 odd different species of various different creatures that I've identified either passing through or a resident in my garden, sharing my garden with me. And that ranges everything from foxes that walk through on a night, quite a wide variety of birds, that some of which are resident, some of which just used my garden as a food resource or shelter or nesting, right through to all sorts of mini beasts and other creatures. And of that 140 species, to give you some idea, I've identified 11 of the 270 UK species of bees. Well, obviously not all of them could live in my garden, and there are, I'm sure, more than 11 because they begin to be quite difficult to identify once you've got to the obvious ones. Also, Sarah, if you could bring up the picture of my favourite shield bugs, I've identified and found 3 of the 30 different shield bugs that there are in the UK. I knew there was one. I'd quite often met the green one, but just by chance I came across the other ones that I think are quite beautiful. I don't know whether they be enlarged slightly, or whether you can just see that there are 3. Maybe they're difficult to see.
Slowly, sorry, my laptop.
Oh, loading. Okay.
Okay.
Then at least you'll know what I'm talking about when I say shield bug, if you didn't know before. So this was I also came across things by chance. So these are some of the beautiful moths that I found originally. But this is a shield bug. This is one of the ones I didn't know was there in the garden. And I certainly didn't know that one was there, which is spectacular, I think. I haven't got the names. I just know they're different kinds. They're in the corner. Oh, good. Yes, that's the wound one. So that, because I've got white dead nettle in my garden, which I've encouraged because it's a wild flower, I guess that's why this came in, because it does like white dead nettle. And that's quite a useful thing to notice, that of course there are specific food plants for different creatures. And then the last one is the most common one, I think. Is there a third one there? Oh no, that's the most beautiful one. Yes, that's. I'm not sure what that one eats. It's just a thing. Once you start doing it, you could research more and more, because you could find out not only what that was, but quite what its food plants are, and so on, and where it lays its babies and all the rest of it. So just to see that, you know, even in my garden, there are 3 different species of shield bugs. And I've only identified 2 of the 27 different UK earthworms there are in the UK, because I've never really focused on earthworms, and they are much trickier to identify. But if anybody's keen on earthworms, there are 27 different species if you want to have a go at trying to find them. I was staggered to learn that someone called Jennifer Owen, which some of you may know about her, did a much more serious, much more comprehensive analysis of the wildlife in her garden over many years. And I think she probably had a bigger garden, because she discovered 8,000 different species, including 4 previously unknown to science. So plenty to go at if you want to. But I want to emphasize mainly the approach to encouraging wildlife in your garden, rather than the detail of the species, really. Because it helps to think of what they need. So obviously they need food and water and shelter. People kind of not so aware of the shelter side of things, and places to breed if they're going to be resident, and to sort of think about the interconnectedness of it all, from the point of view of the food webs that will be happening in the garden and the ecological systems that are there. So that's the approach I try and take, to make sure that there are things there for all those different aspects of the different creatures. And obviously there must be, or those creatures wouldn't now be there. And I've got more excited recently about the soil food webs, not just the food webs that you can perhaps observe above ground, but the almost more important food webs below ground. The last, I suppose, 10 years, 5 years certainly, there's been much more awareness of the importance of fungal mycorrhiza and all that kind of stuff, and the way that plant roots ooze out a mixture of sugars and other complex biochemicals, which actively feed the soil microbes, the bacteria and fungi in the soil, to make it a living soil, and the way that those organisms then create fertility in the soil for the plants, but also for themselves then become food for bigger microbes, and then bigger small insects, which then get eaten by bigger insects, and so on and so on, so on, so on, so on. So that soil food web and the fertility it creates for the whole of the above ground food web is something that's really valuable to encourage and to support. Yeah, and so partly because of lack of time, to be honest, but also partly from an organic gardening approach, I've tended towards a no-dig approach. So I've tended to grow perennials, because then you don't have to keep replanting things. And also you don't have to disturb the soil so much, because the less you disturb the soil, the less you damage that soil fertility and those microorganisms in the first few inches or so, centimeters of the topsoil, which is the living soil, and the more fertile it all is. And feeding it with compost or allowing leaves to just rot down also feeds that and encourages that. I haven't used pesticides or herbicides, so nothing much has been killed, and that again enables creatures to just live and then eat each other. And the more that you do that, the more insects you get, and the more insects you get, some of those will be predatory insects, so they'll eat some of the pest things that you don't want so much perhaps on your plants, but also you'll be providing food for birds and hedgehogs and bats and so on, because of all the insects. So it just produces more life. I mean, my garden is, I don't know, I'm not very good at sizes, but I imagine it's the size of a tennis court or so, something like that. So it's not huge. I mean, it's not small, because I chose it to live here because of the garden, really. But there's an awful lot of life in it once you start looking. So with predatory insects, most people know, for instance, that ladybirds eat vast numbers of aphids. I do occasionally get some black flies or whatever on my roses, say, but it doesn't last long because the ladybirds appear and then the black pie disappear again because they just naturally deal with them. And it's a cycle, it's a food, it's a web. Lots of people are aware of the ladybirds. Not so many people are aware of the wasps and the value of wasps for a garden. I learned something the other day I didn't know, which is that bees evolved from wasps a long time ago. So bees turn out to be pollinators that need the nectar and the pollen from flowers. Or wasps can not only do that as well, sometimes better than bees in terms of pollination for flowers, but they also will eat the pests. So they will eat caterpillars and aphids and things. So they're really, really valuable to the garden. And if you want to encourage pollinators and if you want your garden to be full of flowers, I would suggest that you choose, if you can, at least a mix or mix in UK wildflowers from UK plants, not to be nationalist, but simply because the insects and creatures that live here have flowers in your garden, things, and also because our lines the consent of the crease. And if you are going to do that and you're trying to encourage and support pollinators, it's quite important to plant things that are going to flower right from early spring and over the summer, and then different plants that will flower late summer, because otherwise you're not supporting the insects right the way through their cycle. So right from spring, we're going to be getting the cowslips and the crocuses soon. That's what early pollinators will be totally dependent on. Summer's easier because there's so many different plants, that they could be British plants like foxgloves, clovers, snapdragons, and then winter again gets trickier. So to actually actively seek out things like winter jasmine, some of the hebes that flower in the autumn, and so on. So kind of look for things that you can put in that will just help them survive all year round, to enable them then to hibernate successfully or lay eggs or caterpillars or chrysalids in the ground, whatever it is they do. Quite a few plants from overseas are used by our native pollinators. Not all, but some of them are completely sterile and they look good, but they don't actually provide any food for UK insects. So for instance, Mahonia, if you've got room for them and you don't mind the prickles, are absolutely phenomenal overwintering foods for insects, if you can get one in the garden and you like them. And if you do that, then not just bees and not just butterflies, but hoverflies, beetles, moths and wasps will thank you a lot, and you'll enjoy the flowers as well. Along the same lines, thinking in terms of food and ecology and the food web, be thinking about the different stages of those creatures, the life stages, because you're not just providing for the adults. Well, if you just provide the flowers for the adults, for the nectar and pollinating stages, you might miss out the caterpillar larval stages and the food they need. So if there's any particular things you'd like to be sharing your garden with you need to be thinking about the food plants and planting those for the caterpillars and things. Similarly, moths need specific night nectar producing plants, things like evening primrose, fairly obvious from the name. Tobacco plants, great for moths. Night scented stock, again, flowers and gives out scent at night, surprisingly enough. And also gives you this gorgeous scent. If you're out in the garden on a summer evening, you get the scent from the night scented stock, so it's nice for you too. And if you do all that and you get lots of moths, you're fairly likely, if there's any moths anywhere near in the area, to get bats as well. So you might think of putting up a bat box if you've got a tree or a wall that might work. So that's the kind of range of the ways you can attract things in. You may have known all of that already. I've got a favourite plant that is a bit much for most people. It's an ivy. There's a brief shot of it in the video, which is coming up sometime soon. It's huge. I've let it grow enormous. It's taken over a lilac tree. I have to keep it cut back because it just would completely dominate the whole garden if I didn't. But that single ivy plant is providing the most phenomenal range of nesting places, shelter, food for all sorts of creatures. Just that single plant. It's just crammed full of birds' nests. It provides shelter and from predators for birds during the day and in rain and stuff. It provides phenomenal shelter for insects and hibernating places for insects because it's so densely insulating because it's such a thick thing. When the flowers come out, they're not very noticeable because they're green. But the whole of that huge ivy plant gets absolutely covered in buzzing pollinators, insects, flies, wasps, bees. It's just, you can hear it as you go out in the garden. You can hear it buzzing. And then over the whole of the late autumn, winter, and very early spring, the black ivy berries, which are poisonous to us, are a fabulous food source, packed full of vitamins and food for wood pigeons and blackbirds and all sorts of birds. So that single plant is just incredibly useful. But I do understand that a lot of people would not want a huge ivy plant in their garden because they are quite invasive, I suppose is the word, unless they're dealt with severely. The one sadness I have about the garden is that I've always wanted a pond because of the extra habitat and diversity that brings, but I can't bear to have a pond because I'm right surrounded by where I am. I'm on a kind of corner plot that's on a block, so I'm completely surrounded by roads. And because newt and toad and frog, froglets and young stages, well, and the adults, go out from the pond after the breeding season and spread out over the land to eat, and find shelter elsewhere, I know that a lot of them would end up squashed on the roads roundabout. So I've never been able to bear having a pond. But if you have got room for a pond and you don't live next to a road like me, they are invaluable, again, for diversifying the creatures in your garden. As long as they're deep enough not to get too hot in the summer, and as long as you've got enough variety of oxygenating plants in so they don't get stagnant, they'll look after themselves. You don't even really need to buy things to go in them because dragonflies and water skaters and all sorts of creatures will just happen across the pond and start breeding happily in them. It also provides a ready supply of water for other creatures in your garden, because that's one of the things you also need to remember to try and provide. So talking of habitats, Seren very kindly came one day last week and filmed rather erratically filmed some bits of habitat that I've put up. It's all very, I suppose, hand to mouth, I suppose you'd say, odd bits I've got in my garden to show you some of the things that are specific and things I've actually put in to help some of the wildlife. Don't know whether you want to start showing the video and I'll talk you through that, Seren. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I first of all show you a bought bee habitat pot that you can, the kind of thing you can buy. Nothing ever went in there. I'll have to move it. I keep meaning to move it. On the other hand, my handmade, full of foxglove stalks and bits of straw and twigs covered with a bit of old tile, is absolutely crammed full of. Can you stop it a moment so I can talk to? Will it stop and hold? Yeah, that is absolutely full of various different insects hibernating. Because it's insulated by the tile and sheltered and dry, and you can't quite see them, but in underneath there are quite a few spider webs full of spider eggs. So yeah, that actually did work, even though the bought one didn't. So the pampas grass, normally, I put it in just to remind me to tell you about it, normally is absolutely chock full of hibernating insects. But as you can see, I burnt it down this year because, again, it had got out of hand. I do it every few years. So nothing much there this year. But in the dense parts of that, there's a lot of hibernating insects usually. I'm showing you here the way that I don't clear out the dead leaves underneath the hedge, because that's a very good place for hibernating insects and for things to compost down and for blackbirds to dig out worms and so on. Feeding birds, yes, I make my own fat balls. I think they're better quality than the ones that you can buy already made. And I put out a variety of food for birds in the bird feeder for small birds. And it was raining that day, and or sleeting. And ground feeding birds, I put stuff on the ground. And I always put out a low saucer of water for animals to be able to always have water available. That's the famous ivy. I don't know whether you can see quite how big it is, but it's covered in berries now. So that's the ivy. So that's just a few of the things I've actually actively done. The rest of it I just leave to look after itself. It seems to work. If you're interested in the wildlife, okay, basically the recipe for homemade fat balls is buy some bird food, get some raisins or other dried fruit, get some reasonably quality lard. I do mean lard, sorry, I know it's an animal fat. Warm up the fat very, very gently till it gets to melted. Pour it over the other stuff and let it set, and then put it out. That's my recipe. It's pretty simple. You can do whatever you like with it, really. Put in what you think they'll like. But there's not much, well, there is some point in just knowing. I mean, I get pleasure from just knowing that those creatures are all out there, and more that I don't know about are still out there living and sharing this garden with me. I just enjoy that fact. But if you want to really get into them, you might decide to start trying to identify them like I did, which is quite fun. There's endless amounts of amazing specialist identification things on websites, and a lot of enthusiastic people that'll help you identify them if you want to, and or learn about particular things you particularly get keen on. There's also a lot of citizen science research things you can actually contribute to if you're interested, and it doesn't take much time. Sometimes they're only once a year. So like the Rspb Big Bird Count, which some of you might have done, that's just happened in January. I think it's sat there for an hour counting the birds that come and just reporting it, so they get a sense of the changes in the yearly count of different birds around the country. I also take part in the Big Wasp survey, which happens in the summer, and the Big Butterfly count in a sort of random sort of way. Sometimes I do it, sometimes I don't. I'd like to give a plug to the Leeds Naturalists, because they're the real naturalists. They're the kind of people that can wander around a garden and spout Latin names at insects, which I can't do. And they recognise, I mean, they're just phenomenal. They're a lot of them are in their 70s and 80s and older. And they need younger members, and they're very keen on new people to join them. And they go, well, when there wasn't COVID, they would go on walks and have talks about different creatures in the Leeds area, and they keep records, very detailed records of all the different creatures they're interested in. They're real naturalists. And apart from the pleasure of all of this kind of having creatures to look at and enjoy, there's a bigger reason for encouraging wildlife in the gardens, of course. So you obviously probably all know about the decline of wildlife, but the 2019 State of Nature report for this country stated that there's a 41% decline of wildlife as an average since the 70s, I think 60s, 70s. You know, that classic, I remember when I was a kid and everything was buzzing and everything was wildflowers and wildflowers in the hedges and insects spattered on the car windscreens, and now there isn't. It's gone. So what's staggering, oh, and also with the loss of grasslands and meadows, that, as I mentioned before, wild plants are seriously declining in this country, just ordinary wildflowers, what we would have thought of as wildflowers. But there's over 1 million acres of gardens in this country. And if more of us encourage and enable creatures to live in our gardens until the rest of the land can be regained by regenerative and agriculture with a bit of luck, then we will enable these creatures to survive and then eventually, I hope, thrive, because we'll also be enabling them to have connectivity between each of our gardens. The more of us that do this in our gardens, the creatures will be able to come between our gardens and find food and find refuge and find shelter and find water and find mates and just share the planet with us, really. So I'm hoping that's encouraged you all to do some things at least, and I'm very happy to answer any questions I can, but I'm not claiming I'd be able to answer all of them.
Yeah, if anyone wants to either put them in the chat, or if you know how to raise your hand on the thing, I'll unmute you. I've got a question actually. How can you encourage, you're talking about mycorrhizal networks, like encourage the health of that specifically with plants? Are there any that like specific funguses that you know that are good for encouraging specific kinds of insects? Or
I'm not a specialist enough to know the details of the different fungi, but I do know how to, like I was saying, to not disturbing the soil and providing a variety of plants, actually, apparently encourages and provides for a variety of mycorrhiza. So again, the more different wild plants or other plants that you have, so not monocultures, enables the fungi to thrive better, the fungi in the soil, the mycorrhiza, which then supports more plants, which then supports more other life. So it's a support diversity kind of idea, and that's encouraged by composting, which you can let it do itself. You can let things compost by just letting leaves, instead of tidying up leaves. I mean, again, this is me perhaps being a bit lazy, and I know it does look a bit sad if you let the leaves go all brown and sort of flop about, and then die off and die into the ground. But that enables the earthworms to be able to find food in the warmer patches of the autumn and midwinter. They'll pull those leaves down. So you don't need to actively compost things. You could just let them be composted, and that encourages the mycorrhiza too. So it encourages that cycle. Don't know whether that answered your question, but that's my stab at it.
yeah.
I find ground cover plants also very useful, because it helps to protect the surface of the soil, to stop the it encourages soil fertility, or supports soil fertility, because if you leave the ground bare earth, when it rains, it tends to drain more rapidly through and then leaches out minerals. So the more you can keep the ground covered by living plants and or by compost rotting down, the more it protects the soil fertility for the plants. So things like clover and other ground spreading level plants will help to protect that soil fertility and the mycorrhiza, and I mean, you don't have so much work to do.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh yeah, I should have said, sorry, I should have said that even if you've only got a small window box, any and all of the same sort of ideas can be used. So you know, if you're going to plant up window boxes, why not plant up wildflowers rather than commercial flowers from other countries that may not support pollinators so much? And again, make sure you're putting compost into the container to support the whole system. And if you leave a surface area of compost on the top of the soil, you'll be providing shelter for for what they call mini beasts, small insects and things. So you will be providing a habitat, however small. You know, it's all a benefit. I'm not a specialist on which plants to grow. This is where I point you at websites. But I'm just trying to encourage an approach, really. That's my cop out. Did anybody else have a comment on their garden or what they do to throw in the pot?
Can you hear me? I don't know, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I was wondering about shield bugs, like what they like. So I mean, they're so beautiful, aren't they? And I've seen some on my cabbages, but I haven't seen them anywhere else, I don't think.
They're on them. I mainly find them on my raspberry plants. I don't know why, but actually they're the adults at least, and this is where I keep meaning to have more time to research the life cycles and wonder about things, but I'm so busy doing other things I never get around to it. But I know that the adults are sap suckers, so they will actually pierce the plant stems and suck the sap from the plants. So in some ways you could regard them as pests.
Right.
But they don't seem to do any damage. I mean, I've still got phenomenal crops of raspberries, and other plants seem to survive, and I presume they're providing food for birds and things, so I just let them be.
Yeah, I quite like the idea of going on some shield bug hunts next year, because they're so beautiful. Yeah.
And I again, I don't look for things. I just happen to come across things as I'm digging about in the garden, or you know, just sitting there, I suddenly notice something and start wondering what it is, or following it, or whatever. It's that kind of occupation, really.
My husband, good many years ago now, he wanted a wildlife pond, so we have got one.
I'm jealous.
But I can't garden as I used to garden, neither can he. And it seems I put plants in it, oxygenating plants and other lilies, and now they seem to be taking over the whole pond, and I don't quite know what to do.
It's okay to thin some out. You can thin some out if they really look like they're totally dominating. I mean, if you don't mind them being that abundant, it's fine. But if it feels like they're just getting out of control and they're clogging it up somehow, it's fine to just pull some of them out. If you do, though, it's a good idea to leave them just at the edge, just on the ground edge of the pond, so that any live creatures in them can crawl back into the water, so that you're not killing them when you take the plants out.
Yes, that's what I found last year. I started tidying around, and then I came across a little newt.
So, are you lucky?
One came up outside the back door as well, but so I just left it then. But I felt really guilty then, because I'd been clearing around, and I just hoped I hadn't disturbed any others that might have been there. But so I just pull them out, is it, and leave them outside.
Yeah. I mean, as long as you leave enough to keep the thing oxygenated, it doesn't hurt to take some out. And that's the one thing I missed, actually, the log pile. I've got a very little log pile, because I don't know whether you could see, it's not a huge garden. So I don't have huge logs, you know, I don't have great big logs. I have sticks more, really, or biggish branches piled up at various points in the garden. Because again, they provide shelter, and as they rot down, they provide places for fungi to grow. They provide places for insects to hibernate. And in rotting down, they will fertilize the soil. So rather than tidying away and having to take down to the tip or burn branches and things, just leave them in piles if they're not, looking messy. If you can find something you can tuck them behind and they're not in the way, that provides a lot of habitat for different creatures. Yeah, and when you're gardening, you will kill things, you will disturb things, but if more of the rest of the time you're providing more of a diversity of habitats for more creatures, you're more creating more life than you're damaging it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I've got log piles when, you know, when some trees have been, the bigger shrubs have been cut. I got the log piles, and obviously I keep on putting more logs on as they and I've been putting little piles of pebbles and things. I don't know if that will help.
Yeah, because different creatures like different kinds of habitats, so they'll find whichever they want. Yeah, absolutely. It's just crevices and things can hide in and get away from predators and hibernate in and have their young. They'll use what they want to use. It's great.
Yeah.
Do you know if there are any plants that are kind of not like bug proof, but good vegetables to grow that are going to be left undisturbed, maybe?
That's the trouble with vegetables, is if we like eating them, so do other things. But leeks,
Okay.
leeks and onions are fairly, because of the alim, whatever it is that they have in them, aren't so much eaten. But a lot of cabbagey things are loved by things like cabbage white butterflies and pigeons and things. Yeah. I do grow some vegetables, but I have this. Oh, I've forgotten to mention slugs, because most people hate slugs, and I really like slugs. So I've got this. That's my answer to slugs. I enjoy the slugs. About suggest, contribute.
I'm just wondering now where I could put some ivy.
Hooray! Well, if nobody else has anything to add or ask about, I mean, I'm happy to follow through if anybody. Seren can probably put you in touch with me. I'm happy to help if I can. Like I say, I'm not an expert, I'm just an enthusiast. So I hope that has been of some use and interest.
My sister does, there's quite a local park, and she's been joined the Friends of the park, and she's been making a wildlife area. Brilliant. And if she goes, when she could go away, she very often come back, and one of the other friends had sort of looked at it and thought, oh, this is a mess.
Oh no, oh no, I think I know what's coming.
So when she came, she'd come back, all her work was, and she gets classes from the local schools to come and work in it, you know.
Great, brilliant.
Yeah, she should have been on here tonight, really.
Yeah, well, she probably could have taught us all and me some. Yeah, I mean, yes, is the other thing, I suppose. Yeah, to encourage children and to see if it can be done in a community kind of way. This is just me in my garden, but all of this is relevant to parks and so on. Yeah. And with a bit of luck, to the rest of the countryside eventually, if we can just have some of it reclaimed for wildlife again. Yeah. None of us have to do it the scale of Knepp. I don't know whether any and all of you know about Knepp, the area down south where they've turned their whole a huge estate over just to wildlife, and doing wildlife safaris and running the whole thing just to provide a phenomenal variety of habitats for wildlife. And I think they've just got permission for beavers too. Yes. Don't think there's room for those in my garden. Sadly.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe on the farm.
Yeah. Okay then.
Yeah, if no one's got any more questions, I'll post the link so that people, if they're interested in more, like the other webinars, can like go have a look at all that's going on. Yeah, but thanks, Rosie.
Thank you, Seren. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you very much.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah.
Thank you.